May 12, 1943. The Tunisian sun beats down with a merciless white-hot intensity upon the Cape Bon Peninsula. The air is thick, not just with the swirling grit of the Sahara, but with the heavy metallic scent of spent fuel and the silence of a dying campaign. Thousands of men from the once-invincible Deutsche Afrika Korps stand amidst the wreckage of their panzer divisions. Their uniforms, bleached pale by months of desert warfare, are tattered. Their boots are worn thin by the abrasive sands. They wait in long, jagged lines, hands raised or clasped behind their heads, watching the horizon. For these veterans of the desert, the war has ended not with a glorious final stand, but with the dry, hollow taste of defeat. This moment marked the beginning of one of the most significant logistical and psychological shifts of the Second World War. With the final surrender of Axis forces in North Africa, nearly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers became the responsibility of the Allied powers. It was a mass of humanity that the shattered infrastructure of the Mediterranean could not sustain. The decision was made to transport these men thousands of miles away, across an ocean infested with their own U-boats, to the shores of the United States. For the German soldier, indoctrinated by years of propaganda, this transition was viewed with a deep, paralyzing dread. The emotional landscape of the surrendering German was dominated by a single expectation: brutality. They had been told that the Americans were a soft, decadent people, yet simultaneously capable of unimaginable cruelty toward captives. To the German mind, conditioned by the harsh realities of the Eastern Front and the rigid discipline of the Reich, surrender was often equated with liquidation or, at the very least, forced labor under starvation conditions. They expected the barbed wire and the bayonet. They expected the meager rations of a vengeful victor. Many carried small poison capsules or hid family photographs, certain they would never see home again. They looked at the young American GIs, well-fed, leaning casually against their jeeps, and saw only the precursors to their own demise. Factual records of the surrender underscore the sheer scale of the collapse. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, having seen his supplies of fuel and water evaporate, surrendered the remaining Axis forces, leading to a bottleneck of prisoners that overwhelmed temporary enclosures. The prisoners were processed with a clinical efficiency that they found unsettling. Data shows that in these early days, the primary concern of the American captors was not retribution, but sanitation and caloric intake. While the Germans waited for the lash, they were instead met with the systematic registration of their names and ranks. They were stripped of their weapons, but not their dignity, a concept that felt alien in the heat of the Tunisian dust. Among the rubble and the heat, the first subtle shifts in perception began to take root. A German sergeant, clutching a rusted canteen, watched as an American private opened a wooden crate. There was no shouting, no performative displays of power. Instead, there was the methodical distribution of supplies. In this harsh, arid environment, the prisoners began to notice something that would become the central theme of their captivity: the presence of luxury in the midst of war. It started with the smell of high-quality tobacco and the sight of clean, white bandages. The ideology of the master race was forced to reconcile with the reality of an enemy that possessed a surplus of everything, even compassion. June 1943. The Mid-Atlantic. The hull of a Liberty ship groans as it crests a massive, slate-gray swell, plunging deep into the trough before rising again. Inside the cavernous hold, thousands of German prisoners are packed into tiered canvas bunks. The air is thick with the smell of diesel, salt spray, and the distinct sour tang of nervous sweat. Every time the steel plates shudder from the distant percussion of a depth charge or the vibration of the ship's propellers, a ripple of tension moves through the dark. They are a defeated army, moving across a graveyard of sunken tonnage, headed toward an unknown fate in a land they have only ever seen on propaganda posters. The voyage across the Atlantic was a massive undertaking, part of a fleet of ships returning to America after delivering the tools of war to the European and African theaters. It was more efficient to fill these empty vessels with human cargo than to let them sail in ballast. For the prisoners, the journey was a period of forced introspection. They were men caught between two worlds, the crumbling certainty of the Third Reich and the terrifying mystery of the American continent. Every day spent moving westward was a day further from the fatherland, and every sunrise over the open ocean brought them closer to what they feared would be their final destination. The contrast between expectation and reality began to sharpen within the confines of the ship. Many of the men had been told that the Americans were starving, their cities in ruins from U-boat blockades, and their resources depleted. They expected to be fed watery soup or horse meat, if they were fed at all. Instead, they were greeted by the steady, rhythmic clatter of metal trays. Twice a day, they stood in line as American mess cooks ladled out hot stew, canned peaches, and thick slices of bread. The German soldiers, many of whom had survived on meager rations of hardtack and dried sausage during the retreat to Tunis, stared at their plates in silence. The food was not just sustenance, it was an unintentional display of overwhelming logistical power. Historical records from these transport logs indicate that the Americans adhered strictly to the directives of the Geneva Convention, which mandated that prisoners receive rations equal in quality to those of the capturing power's base troops. This meant the Germans were often eating better than they had in their own barracks back in Europe. Some prisoners, suspicious of this sudden bounty, whispered that the food was poisoned or that this was a last meal before they were cast overboard. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and the meals remained consistent, the suspicion began to give way to a haunting realization. If the enemy could afford to feed their captives this well in the middle of a contested ocean, the stories of American weakness were a lie. The recurring symbol of this abundance was found in the bread. In Germany, as the war progressed, the bread had become dark, heavy, and often stretched with sawdust or potato flour, the K-brought of a nation under siege. On the Liberty ships, the prisoners were handed thick, pillowy slices of white bread. It was soft, unervingly pale, and tasted faintly of milk and sugar. To a soldier who had spent years under the austerity of the Reich, this bread was a revelation. It was a physical manifestation of a civilization that had not yet been touched by the shadow of hunger. As they chewed, the rigid ideological walls they had built around themselves began to show the first hairline fractures, softened by the simple, undeniable reality of American flour. July 1943. The Norfolk harbor in Virginia emerges from the morning mist like a shimmering mirage of steel and glass. As the Liberty ships slow their engines, the German prisoners crowd the deck railings, squinting against the brilliant American sun. They do not see the jagged, blackened ruins of a bombed-out quay or the skeletal remains of a city under siege. Instead, they see a skyline that defies every word of the radio broadcasts they had heard in Berlin. The air is clear of the smell of cordite and burning rubber. It is replaced by the scent of pine, wet pavement, and the distant, sweet aroma of industrial production. Cars move in steady streams along coastal roads, their headlights gleaming, a casual display of fuel wealth that would be unthinkable in a Europe governed by horse-drawn carts and charcoal-burning engines. The arrival at a U.S. port was a moment of profound psychological disorientation for the German soldier. This was the arsenal of democracy, the engine room of the Allied war effort, and it was entirely unscathed. The historical significance of this arrival lay in the immediate dismantling of the myth of German superiority. The men standing on those decks were members of a military culture that believed total war required total sacrifice. Seeing a nation at war that still enjoyed the luxuries of civilian normalcy was a shock to their foundational logic. They were entering a country that didn't just have enough resources to fight them, it had enough resources to ignore the war in its own streets. The emotional contrast for these men was visceral. Many had spent the last few years under the blackout regulations of the Reich, where a single sliver of light from a window could bring the secret police to the door. As evening fell over the harbor, the Americans did not douse their lights. The city stayed bright, a glowing testament to security and power. The prisoners expected to be marched through angry mobs or executed in the shadows of the docks. They expected the vengeful faces of a population suffering from the deprivations of conflict. Instead, they saw dockworkers who barely looked up from their tasks, and young women in bright summer dresses who watched the ships pass with curiosity rather than hatred. The subhumans they were told inhabited the Americas looked remarkably healthy, confident, and utterly unafraid. Factual documentation of these arrivals describes a process of military precision that lacked the characteristic cruelty the Germans were accustomed to. Upon disembarking, the prisoners were processed through delousing stations and medical tents. They were given clean, sturdy fatigues, often marked with a large PW on the back. But even in this branding, there was a level of quality that unsettled them. The fabric was heavy, the stitching was perfect, and the boots provided were often better than the ones they had surrendered in Tunis. They were being clothed by an enemy that viewed their survival as a matter of bureaucratic necessity rather than a burden. It was here, on the American docks, that the recurring symbol of white bread reappeared, now joined by another startling sight, the humble sandwich. As they were led toward waiting trains, many prisoners were handed wax paper-wrapped bundles. Inside was more of that impossibly white, soft bread, layered with thick cuts of ham and cheese. To the German eye, this was not just a snack, it was a week's worth of rations served as a single gesture of convenience. The bread was so white it looked like bleached bone, yet it felt like a cloud in their hands. As they boarded the trains, the realization began to sink in. They had not been captured by a starving, desperate people. They had been captured by a giant that lived in a world of endless white flour and golden butter. August 1943. The rhythmic clicking of steel wheels on iron rails provides a hypnotic soundtrack to the journey westward. Inside the Pullman passenger cars, German soldiers press their foreheads against the glass, watching a world that defies their comprehension. They are crossing the Great Plains, a landscape of such staggering scale that the narrow borders of Europe begin to feel like a distant, claustrophobic memory. Mile after mile, the horizon is dominated by the golden sway of wheat, an ocean of grain that seems to have no end. There are no tank traps in these fields, no craters from artillery shells, and no weeping widows searching through rubble. There is only the vast, quiet productivity of a continent that has turned its soil into a weapon of abundance. This transit across the American interior was more than a mere movement of prisoners. It was a deliberate, if secondary, psychological operation. As the trains rolled through the Midwest, the United States government made little effort to hide its agricultural and industrial heartland from the captives. The historical context of this journey is rooted in the sheer logistical confidence of the American war machine. While the Reich struggled with the Battle of the Atlantic to keep its people from starving, the Americans were moving thousands of tons of grain across their own territory with casual ease. For the German POWs, this was a moment of profound realization. The war was not being fought against a country, but against an industrial giant that had mastered the earth itself. The emotional contrast within the train cars was a mixture of awe and simmering resentment. These men had been raised on the concept of Lebensraum, the living space that the Nazi Party claimed Germany needed to survive and thrive. They had been told that they must conquer the East, the fertile black soil of Ukraine, to secure the future of the Germanic people. Yet here, through a train window in Kansas and Nebraska, they saw a Lebensraum that already existed, flourishing under a democracy they had been taught to despise. They saw small towns where children played without gas masks and farmers who drove tractors that looked more modern than many of the tanks the Wehrmacht had deployed in Russia. The German soldier, who had been told he was fighting for the survival of his civilization, was forced to confront the fact that his enemy's civilization was thriving in a state of unburdened plenty. Factual observations from the journals of these prisoners describe the unsettling silence of the American landscape. There were no sirens, no patrols, and no signs of the desperation that had gripped the European continent. The trains stopped at small-town stations to take on water, and the prisoners watched as civilian life carried on with a startling lack of military oversight. They saw grocery stores with crates of fruit piled high on the sidewalks and bakeries that filled the air with the scent of yeast and sugar. The data of American food production was no longer an abstract statistic in a briefing. It was a physical reality passing by at 60 miles per hour. The recurring symbol of the white loaf of bread took on a new, almost spiritual dimension during this journey. At every major stop, the American Red Cross or military stewards would bring in crates of fresh supplies. The prisoners were served meals that included more of the soft, bleached bread they had first encountered on the ships. By now, the novelty had been replaced by a deep, gnawing question. How could a nation produce so much of this luxury that they could afford to give it to those who had tried to destroy them? To the German mind, bread was a symbol of struggle, of a nation's blood and soil. In America, it seemed to be a basic right, as plentiful as the air itself. This bread, so white it seemed to glow in the dim light of the train car, was becoming the ultimate evidence of an ideology that valued the individual's plate as much as the state's power. September 1943. The train slows to a halt at a remote siding in the Alabama countryside. As the doors slide open, the German prisoners are greeted by the sharp, earthy scent of southern pine and the rhythmic chirping of cicadas. Before them lies Camp Aliceville, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks, watchtowers, and double-perimeter chain-link fences. To the battle-hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps, the sight of a permanent camp usually signaled the beginning of a slow decline into malnutrition and despair. They braced themselves for the inevitable, the crowded, lice-infested quarters and the meager, watery gruel that defined the prisoner experience in the European theater. They expected to be treated as the defeated, a category of human that, in their own military doctrine, had forfeited all rights to comfort. The arrival at a permanent facility like Aliceville was the moment where the abstract journey became a concrete reality. The United States eventually housed nearly 425,000 German prisoners across more than 500 camps, mostly situated in the South and Southwest. The historical significance of these camps lay in their adherence to the base troop standard. According to military regulations, the living conditions for a German private had to mirror those of an American private stationed at a nearby training base. This was not a matter of sentimentality, but a rigorous application of international law and a strategic attempt to demonstrate the superiority of the democratic system. For the Germans, entering the barracks was like stepping into a parallel dimension where the war had never reached the level of total destruction. The emotional shock upon entering the barracks was profound. The men found clean, sturdy cots with wool blankets, functional plumbing, and hot showers. They saw screened windows to keep out the insects and coal-burning stoves for the coming winter. Many of the prisoners, having spent years in the filth of trenches or the burning sands of the desert, wept at the sight of a clean porcelain sink. They had been told that American society was a chaotic, disorganized mess of conflicting races and interests. Instead, they found a level of organized care that felt more Germanic than anything they had left behind in the fatherland. The psychological weight of this realization was heavy. It was difficult to maintain a belief in one's inherent superiority when the inferior enemy provided a higher standard of living to its captives than the Reich did to its frontline soldiers. Factual reports from the early months of Aliceville's operation note a surprising lack of disciplinary issues. The prisoners were divided into companies and allowed to maintain their own internal military structure, provided it didn't conflict with camp rules. The calorie counts were meticulously recorded. The Germans were consuming between 3,000 and 4,000 calories a day. In a time when their families back in Germany were surviving on ersatz coffee and rationed potatoes, these men were gaining weight. They were given access to a post-exchange where they could buy toiletries, beer, and snacks using canteen coupons earned through labor. The system was designed to be self-regulating, a stark contrast to the fear-based management of the camps they had administered in occupied territories. At the center of this new life stood the camp mess hall, and within it, the recurring symbol of American democracy, the endless supply of white bread. In the camp kitchens, German bakers, themselves prisoners, were given high-grade American flour, yeast, and sugar. They were tasked with baking bread for their comrades, and the result was a daily mountain of golden-crusted, snow-white loaves. As the men sat at long wooden tables, the smell of fresh baking filled the air, a scent that represented the very heart of the American home. This bread was not rationed by a fearful state. It was provided in such quantities that it became a background element of their existence. To the prisoners, the white bread was no longer just food. It was a quiet, persistent argument against the ideology of scarcity they had been raised to serve. October 1943. The early morning frost clings to the cotton bowls of the Mississippi Delta, a sea of white that mirrors the snowy peaks of the Bavarian Alps, yet feels entirely alien. Under the watchful but relaxed eyes of a few American guards, groups of German men climb down from transport trucks and step into the soft, tilled earth. These are no longer just soldiers. They are laborers, part of a vast agricultural workforce necessitated by the drain of American manpower to the front lines. They carry burlap sacks and specialized tools, moving with a precision learned on the drill fields of Prussia. But today, that discipline is applied to the harvest of a foreign power. The implementation of the labor program was a cornerstone of the American POW experience, governed by strict regulations that transformed the nature of the prisoners' captivity. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, non-commissioned officers and privates could be required to work, provided the labor was not dangerous and did not directly support the manufacture of weapons. For the American government, this provided a crucial solution to the labor shortages threatening the national food supply. For the German prisoners, it was an entry point into the domestic life of their enemy. They were paid 80 cents a day in scrip, a wage that allowed them to participate in the camp's microeconomy, further cementing their role within a system defined by commerce and productivity rather than mere subjugation. The emotional impact of this shared labor was transformative. Working side by side with American civilians, often elderly farmers or young women, shattered the German soldier's image of the Untermensch or the decadent American. They saw farmers who treated their livestock with care and possessed a mechanical ingenuity that the Germans had been told was exclusive to their own culture. In the heat of the afternoon, it was not uncommon for an American farmer to offer a German prisoner a glass of iced tea or a seat in the shade, gestures of simple human recognition that were forbidden by the formal decrees of the Nazi Party. The German men, who had been conditioned to view life as a Darwinian struggle for dominance, were confronted with a society that seemed to operate on a foundation of casual, unforced cooperation. Factual accounts from these labor details reveal a surprisingly high level of productivity and mutual respect. Farmers often requested the same German crews back day after day, noting their punctuality and technical skill. In return, the prisoners observed the inner workings of American prosperity. They saw the kitchens of the farmhouses through open windows, noting the refrigerators, the electric stoves, and the abundance of consumer goods that even middle-class Germans could only dream of before the war. This was not the dying empire, described by Goebbels. It was a vibrant, youthful nation that seemed to have mastered the art of living well while simultaneously fighting a global war. The recurring symbol of American abundance, the white bread, appeared here in its most intimate form. During the midday break, the farmers would often bring out baskets of sandwiches for the workers. The prisoners would sit on the edge of the fields, their hands stained with the dust of American soil, holding slices of bread that were softer and whiter than the finest cake available in Berlin. Sometimes, the bread was spread with peanut butter or thick layers of fruit preserves, luxuries that were virtually non-existent in a continent under blockade. As they ate, the ideology of the Reich, which demanded total sacrifice and glorified hardship, began to seem increasingly hollow. The white bread was the silent ambassador of a system that didn't need to starve its people to be powerful. It was the taste of a freedom that was measured not in flags and parades, but in the fullness of a common worker's lunch. November 1943. The interior of the camp library is hushed, illuminated by the warm amber glow of desk lamps that cast long shadows across rows of polished wooden shelves. A German corporal, his uniform clean and pressed, runs a finger along the spines of books that would have been consigned to the flames in the plazas of Berlin or Munich. Here, in the heart of the American South, the intellectual landscape is as vast and uncurbed as the prairie. The air carries the scent of aged paper, floor wax, and the faint, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco. There are no censors standing guard, no index librorum prohibitorum of the Nazi state. There is only the quiet, terrifying weight of unfiltered information. The intellectual and cultural life afforded to German prisoners was perhaps the most subversive element of their captivity. While the Reich maintained control through the strict narrowing of the mind, the American camp system operated on the principle of expansion. The historical reality of these programs was a sophisticated intellectual diversion effort. Prisoners were encouraged to form orchestras, theater troupes, and soccer leagues. They were given access to American newspapers, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, which arrived daily, filled with news of Allied victories and German retreats. To a man who had been fed a steady diet of state-controlled triumphs, the sight of a free press was a structural shock to his worldview. The emotional dissonance of this period was centered on the concept of truth. In Germany, truth was a weapon of the state. In the camps, it appeared to be a commodity available to anyone with the patience to read. The prisoners watched Hollywood films in the camp theaters, marveling at the depiction of a world where individuals could criticize their leaders without disappearing into a midnight cellar. They formed universities behind barbed wire, with captured professors lecturing on philosophy, history, and law. The realization that their captors did not fear their education, but actively facilitated it, suggested a level of societal confidence that the German soldiers found both enviable and deeply unsettling. Factual data from the Provost Marshal General's records shows that the U.S. government spent millions on educational materials for the camps. By late 1943, thousands of prisoners were enrolled in correspondence courses from major American universities. They were learning the English language not for the purpose of interrogation, but as a tool for understanding the democracy that had defeated them. They studied the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights, finding in those documents a radical alternative to the Führerprinzip they had sworn to follow. The camp was no longer just a place of confinement. It had become a laboratory of the mind, where the rigid certainties of National Socialism were being quietly dismantled by the sheer force of logic and open inquiry. Yet, even in the depths of intellectual exploration, the physical world continued to provide the most potent symbols of this new reality. In the camp canteens, where the men gathered after their lectures or rehearsals, the white loaf of bread remained the primary signifier of American life. It sat on the tables during their discussions, a soft, pale accompaniment to their coffee and beer. To the German prisoner, the bread was the base of the democratic pyramid. If a society could provide its citizens with an education as rich as its flour and a press as open as its fields, then perhaps the decadence they were warned about was actually a form of strength they had never been allowed to imagine. The white bread, consistent and plentiful, was the edible proof that a nation did not need to chain the mind to fill the stomach. December 1943. The winter air in the American heartland is crisp and biting, but inside the camp infirmary, the atmosphere is one of sterile, clinical warmth. A German soldier, formerly of the 15th Panzer Division, lies on a clean white cot, watching a glass bottle of intravenous saline drip rhythmically. The room is quiet, save for the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. He is being treated for a recurring bout of malaria contracted in the marshes of Tunisia. In his mind, He had prepared for a shallow grave in the sand or a cold corner of a crowded barracks. Instead, he is surrounded by the hum of high-efficiency heaters and the sight of stainless steel instruments reflecting the light of an electric bulb that never flickers. The operation of the Geneva Convention within the American camp system was not merely a legal obligation. It was a logistical marvel that served as a profound psychological weapon. While the Third Reich moved toward a state of total war that increasingly viewed prisoners as expendable resources or burdens to be eliminated, the United States maintained a standard of care that was functionally identical to that of its own military. This meant that the German POW was integrated into a medical and nutritional infrastructure that prioritized his survival. The historical reality was a system that provided advanced surgical care, dental work, and vaccinations to men who, just months prior, were attempting to dismantle the very nation that now preserved their lives. The emotional struggle for the prisoners during this period was a conflict of conscience. They were men who had been taught that the state was the ultimate authority and that the individual was merely a cell in the larger national organism. In the American camps, they were treated as individuals with specific medical needs and caloric requirements. When a prisoner fell ill, he was not cast aside. He was moved to a facility that often surpassed the civilian hospitals of his hometown in Westphalia or Saxony. The realization that an enemy would expend such vast resources to save a single captive's life was more damaging to the Nazi ideology than any artillery barrage. It suggested a moral hierarchy that the German soldier had never been allowed to consider, a world where the value of a human being was not tied to his utility to the party. The factual data regarding this care remains one of the most remarkable chapters of the domestic war effort. Prisoners were monitored for weight loss, and those found to be below the standard were given supplemental feedings. The dental records from camps across the South show that many Germans received their first fillings and extractions under the care of American Army dentists. They were provided with high-quality soap, razors, and clean towels, items that had become priceless luxuries in the tightening grip of the European theater. The Americans were not just housing their enemies, they were maintaining them in a state of peak physical health, a feat that required a surplus of energy and material that the Axis powers could no longer fathom. The recurring symbol of the white bread appeared in the infirmaries and mess halls with a steady, haunting regularity. Even in the hospital wards, the soft diet for recovering patients included slices of the same bleached, pillowy bread that had greeted them at the docks. It was easy to digest, sweet to the tongue, and seemingly inexhaustible in its supply. To the bedridden soldier, this bread was a sign of a civilization that had conquered the problem of scarcity. It sat on his bedside tray, a white beacon in the dim winter light, representing a system that chose to feed its enemies the same flour it fed its sons. The bread was the ultimate proof of a democracy's confidence, a nation so wealthy in spirit and soil that it could afford to be merciful to those who had sought its ruin. May 1945. The warm Alabama air hangs heavy with the scent of blooming honeysuckle, but inside the recreation hall of the camp, the atmosphere is freezing and hollow. A projector flickers to life, casting a harsh, jittery beam of light against a white sheet tacked to the wall. For the first time, the German prisoners sit in total, suffocating silence as the images from the liberation of Belsen, Buchenwald, and Dachau appear before them. They see the skeletal remains of human beings stacked like cordwood. They see the ash and the industrial scale of murder that their government had perpetrated in their names. The shadows on the wall are a dark mirror, forcing them to look at a version of their nation that they had either ignored or never dared to imagine. The end of the war in Europe brought about the most painful phase of the prisoner's journey, the formal program of re-education. As the Third Reich collapsed into a pile of rubble and shame, the United States military began to expose the captives to the full extent of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. This was not a physical punishment, but a psychological reckoning. The prisoners were forced to confront the fact that while they were being fed, clothed, and treated with meticulous care in the American heartland, their own leaders were overseeing a continental slaughterhouse. The historical significance of this moment was the total destruction of the myth of German moral superiority. The men who had been treated as guests by their enemies realized they were the representatives of a nightmare. The emotional fallout was a mixture of denial, horror, and profound existential crisis. Some men wept openly, while others stared at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the American guards who had shared their tobacco and their stories. The contrast was no longer just about resources, it was about the fundamental value of life. They looked at their own healthy, sun-tanned limbs, the result of 2 years of high-caloric American rations and outdoor labor, and felt a sickening sense of guilt. They had survived and thrived in the hands of the enemy, while those their government deemed unworthy of life had been reduced to smoke and bone. The ideology that had sustained them through the desert and the Atlantic crossing was finally, irrevocably dead. Documentation of this transition period highlights the shift from military discipline to civic preparation. The Special Projects Division intensified its efforts to teach the prisoners the mechanics of democracy, preparing them for a return to a Germany that no longer existed. They were shown that the strength of America was not just in its factories, but in its ability to admit its own flaws and protect the rights of the minority. They learned that a nation's greatness was measured by its capacity for mercy, even toward those who had sought its destruction. The camp was no longer a cage. It was a classroom for a new kind of German citizen, one who understood that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance against the very darkness they had once served. The recurring symbol of the white loaf of bread took on its final, most bitter irony during these film screenings. At the end of the day, as they returned to their barracks, the prisoners were still served the same soft white bread that had come to define their American experience. But now, as they held the pale slices in their hands, they thought of the starved faces on the projector screen. The bread was a reminder of the life they had been given and the lives that had been stolen. It was a symbol of a civilization that had enough to share, and the devastating cost of a regime that believed in the politics of theft and hunger. The white bread, once a sign of simple luxury, was now the bread of the living, a weight in their stomachs that they would carry back to the ruins of their homes. June 1946. The port of Bremerhaven, Germany, appears as a skeletal graveyard of twisted iron and pulverized brick. As the repatriation ships pull alongside the cracked piers, the German men standing on deck do not cheer. They look out at a landscape where the very air seems to taste of cold ash and stagnant water. They are returning to a country that has been scrubbed of its monuments and its pride, a place where the rubble is stacked high and the future is a hollow, gray void. These men, once the vanguard of a 1,000-year empire, are now ghosts returning to a ruins, carrying with them the strange, heavy burden of having been well treated by the men who destroyed their world. The repatriation of German prisoners from American soil was the final movement in a massive human migration. Between 1945 and 1946, the vast network of U.S. camps was emptied, and the men were sent back to a continent struggling to feed itself. The historical weight of this return lay in the seeds that had been planted during their captivity. They were not returning as the same soldiers who had surrendered in the dust of Tunisia. They had spent years in a land of unimaginable plenty, and they were bringing back a radical new understanding of what a nation could be. They were the first generation of a new Germany, one that had learned the lessons of democracy not through slogans, but through the quality of a blanket and the consistency of a meal. The emotional contrast of the homecoming was devastating. In the American camps, these men had gained weight, received medical care, and lived in heated barracks. Now, they stepped off the ships into a reality of starvation rations and black bread that was once again stretched with sawdust. They saw their wives and children with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks, living in cellars beneath the wreckage of their former lives. The softness of their American captivity became a source of private, agonizing guilt. They realized that the most powerful weapon the Americans had deployed against them was not the Sherman tank or the Mustang fighter, but the simple, unadorned fact of their own humanity. The mercy they had received in Alabama or Kansas was now a distant, shining memory in a world of hunger and cold. Factual records of the post-war era show that many former POWs became the most vocal advocates for the reconstruction of Germany along democratic lines. They had seen the alternative to the Führerprinzip and found it to be more efficient, more resilient, and infinitely more compassionate. The data of their survival, the low mortality rates and the high standards of health, stood as a permanent indictment of the regime they had once served. They organized themselves into veterans groups that prioritized reconciliation over retribution, using their experiences in the United States as a blueprint for a society that valued the individual. The re-education had worked, not because of the films or the lectures, but because of the lived experience of fair treatment in a land of abundance. The recurring symbol of the white loaf of bread found its final, poetic resting place in the stories these men told their children. 4 decades after the war, the American bread remained a legend in German households, a story of a food so white it looked like snow and so soft it felt like a dream. It became a metaphor for the American spirit, a culture of surplus that chose to feed its enemies rather than break them. This bread was the tangible proof that abundance is the most effective antidote to tyranny. In the end, the German soldiers were not conquered by force alone. They were seduced by the possibility of a world where no one had to be hungry. The white loaf was the silent promise of a freedom that begins at the dinner table and ends in the soul of a nation that has finally learned to choose peace over power.